Okay, it's 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Good evening, and thank you for joining Straight Ahead, Americans for Prosperity, Amistad Law Project, Abolitionist Law Center, and FAMM tonight for What's Next for Second Chances in Pennsylvania. I'm Maria Goellner, Pennsylvania State Policy Director for FAMM. We are honored to be here tonight and also to moderate tonight's panel. FAMM is a nonpartisan advocacy organization that works to create a more fair and effective justice system that respects our American values of individual accountability and dignity while also keeping communities safe. Personally, I'm a mother of two, public interest and trial attorney, and have worked with thousands and thousands of families going through the legal system here in Pennsylvania, my home state, and also Florida and New York City. I'm going to ask our panelists to please briefly introduce both themselves and also the organization that they work with. And I'm going to start tonight with Roxanne Horrell from Straight Ahead. Roxanne, if you wouldn't mind tapping the next panelist to speak after you, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel tonight. And as Maria said, my name is Roxanne Horrell, and I work for an organization called Straight Ahead. Straight Ahead, you might not have heard of us, but we are the C4 arm of Abolitionist Law Center. And, basically we were created to advocate to end life without parole in Pennsylvania, in addition to winning geriatric and medical parole. And so I will pass it to Kris.
Hi, I'm Kris Henderson. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the executive director of Amistad Law Project. We do organizing and legal work, trying to get people out of Pennsylvania prisons and trying to get our communities the resources that we need. And I'm going to pass it to Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Reyes, and I'm also here as an advocate, as a dual victim, and with CABI, which is the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. And I will pass it on to Greg.
My name is Greg Glod. I am the Criminal Justice Fellow for Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity is a grassroots organization that advocates for policies that break barriers to people realizing the American dream. We have chapters in 35 states, and we work at the federal level. One of our chapters is in Pennsylvania, and they advocate on policies, ranging on a wide variety of topics, but I solely work on criminal justice issues. So really excited to be here and talk about a very important issue tonight.
Thank you so much. So FAMM has a second chance agenda, which many of you may have seen, and we'll put a link for that in the chat. Our second chance agenda, which we've been advocating here in Pennsylvania for some time, includes creating medical and geriatric mechanisms for release from prison, expanding clemency, ending automatic mandatory life without parole, because we believe judges should always have the discretion to impose individualized sentences. And this week, we actually released a report called Time for Justice, the Urgent Need for Second Chances in Pennsylvania Sentencing System, which focuses on extreme sentencing in Pennsylvania over the last 40 years. So I'm going to take just a moment and highlight a few of the key findings from that report before we jump into our panel. The most important, I think, findings from this report, which I hope you all read, it's not too long to dive in and do as bedtime reading, is that Pennsylvania state prison population has been shaped by some of the harshest sentencing laws in the country. So in 2019, we incarcerated about 7 times the number of people that we did in 1970. And to give you an idea, it's about 900 people in 1980 were serving 20+ year sentences, anywhere from 20 years to life. Today, it's around 9,000 people. So we have a lot more people going in, and we have a lot less people coming out. And probably the most important thing in this report is that it was not driven by crime, and it's not driven by crime today. So this was driven by punitive policy choices. Over the last 40 years in this report, we match up crime rates, particularly homicide rates, to the skyrocketing incarceration, and they do not track. And the two biggest drivers of this skyrocketing incarceration were the creation of mandatory life imprisonment for first and second degree murder, and the denial of parole for anyone doing life in Pennsylvania for any reason. And so that you know, we are one of only 7 states in the entire country that doesn't offer any parole opportunities at all to lifers. So we're an outlier nationwide, and not in a good way. And it's very important, I think, for us to make sure that we get the message out there, especially to lawmakers, that Pennsylvania would not be going out on a limb by enacting second chance laws, the ones that we'll be discussing here tonight. We are actually out on a limb now by leading the nation in extreme sentences. And these punitive laws have overwhelmingly impacted families of color. For instance, Black people make up less than 11% of Pennsylvania's population, but 65% of the people serving life. And that is unacceptable. We have a huge crisis with the elderly and sick in prison, which have increased 30-fold from 1979 to today. And we know that older people and those with medical issues are the least dangerous, but cost the most to incarcerate. And we really detail that in this report. That cost is on the backs of taxpayers and families, which everyone attending here tonight is. Study after study, and we summarize this in the report, shows that you age out of crime, people age out of crime, and healthcare is extremely expensive. So overall, one of the biggest findings in the report is that this 40-year experiment of really skyrocketing incarceration and extreme sentences is a very high cost, very low value proposition for taxpayers and obviously for families. And lawmakers, families, people, lawyers, everybody that I talk to is typically shocked to find out that the latest DOC budget was $2.6 billion. That's not for 40 years, that's not for 10 years, that's for 1 year. So every single year, the Pennsylvania State Department of Corrections budget is $2 billion plus. And it costs about $50,000 plus to incarcerate someone for 1 year. So we're not being made safer by this. These extreme sentences are really harming communities, families, the economy, and they are often excessive, unjust, and don't consider individual factors because they're mandatory. They're one size fits all. So knowing that this hasn't worked, knowing that parole rates have declined, commutations have dried up, medical release in Pennsylvania only let out about 9 people between 2010 and 2015, while about 850 died in prison. What do we do? And so what this report looked at and what we came to at FAMM as recommendations were many of the things and some other ones that we're going to talk about here tonight. And really overall, what I want people to take away is re-envisioning what sentencing in Pennsylvania looks like, re-envisioning it as a redemptive system that encourages rehabilitation and growth. There are ways to build that into our sentencing system, and it's through making second chance legislation like we're going to be discussing tonight. So please, please check out the paper and look at our specific recommendations, which are going to be discussed throughout the panel tonight. So I want to break down each key topic by area a little bit further. And I mentioned quite a bit life without parole. So I want to take a few minutes and I want to ask Roxanne to please give us an overview of life without parole. What is the state of life without parole in Pennsylvania? Why is this important? What's going on? And what do we do about it?
Thank you, Maria. So really briefly, so some of you might be wondering, what is life without parole? So life without parole is exactly what it sounds like. So it's a life sentence without the possibility of getting parole, right? So this happens when, someone is committed a very serious crime, and like the judge in that case doesn't have discretion to consider another sentence. So this is the reality in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the only state that has mandatory life without parole sentencing for second-degree murder, and only 1 of 7 that has it for first-degree murder. So Pennsylvania is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to life without parole. And life without parole can also be defined as death by incarceration because it more accurately reflects the reality of the sentence. Because the reality is that people are sentenced to die in prison because there's no opportunity to be released. Parole is an opportunity to be released. And these people that are sentenced, to these mandatory sentences do not have an opportunity. So therefore they're sentenced to die in prison. So it's more accurately described as death by incarceration. And so in Pennsylvania, because we have these extreme sentencing laws, it's created this really big problem where we have this growing lifer population in prisons that have no release valve to get out. And so like, I think Maria mentioned some of this, but from 1980 to 2019, the lifer population in Pennsylvania went from 848 to over 5,000. So that's a six-fold increase of just, people convicted of first and second degree murder serving life sentences. And that's in the last 40 years. And, this is a problem that is only getting worse. We are seeing people going in at, very young ages, and then coming out and not coming out. And so like the average age in prison right now for lifers, I believe, is around 50. And, and it's not because, these people were convicted when they were old, it's because they were sentenced when they were very young and they're getting old in prison. And so, what we're advocating for in Pennsylvania is reform to these policies, these very archaic policies, because there's no other good alternatives in Pennsylvania at the moment. We need a release valve. Like, this is only going to get worse. And, we're going to be talking about, potential legislation, but we need parole eligibility for lifers, which would create an opportunities for these people to get out. And then I'm going to pass it to Greg, I believe.
Thank you, Roxanne. I want to throw in that I'm glad you brought up the age of people going in. One of the things that we found in researching our paper was that there are a significant number of people in Pennsylvania prisons who have done more time, more years in prison than the number of years that they were alive when they committed the crime. Yeah. And that's really tough to fit into any vision that anyone has of justice, that they should have no opportunity at that point to apply for revisitation of that sentence. So Greg, what is AFP's take on life without parole? And we've commented a little bit on our status in the nation, but can you say anything about what you've seen in other states and just generally how AFP is dealing with the lifer population in your policy work?
Yeah, absolutely. We feel that parole is something that should be provided to every individual that's incarcerated. Now, when we talk about parole and parole eligibility, those are two different things, right? And so it makes absolutely no sense that individuals, we send them to places called, departments of correction, departments of rehabilitation. We potentially provide programming, want them to do well while they're incarcerated, and then say, we're not going to give you any opportunity for a second chance in your life, even if you've, done amazing things while you've been incarcerated. I know I was just in Mississippi and talking to their Department of Corrections commissioner who used to work in Angola, and they have a terrific program there with a lot of the lifers that are in there. And the individuals that I was meeting that he brought over from the Angola prison down to the Mississippi ones to do mentorship programs are some of the most incredible people you ever meet. People that should have never been incarcerated for 30, 40, 50 years when they committed a crime when they were 18 years old. And so we really feel that all individuals should have an opportunity to go before a parole board, state their case of what they have done since they have been incarcerated and why they're still okay to be, successfully re-entered society. And so that's our baseline. And so obviously, based upon the things that we have heard so far in Pennsylvania, we feel that Pennsylvania corrections are woefully failing at that opportunity. And so we kind of heard how much of an outlier they are. 1 in 7 states that have mandatory life without parole for first and second degree murder. A couple stats that just really shock me. 13% of incarcerated individuals in Pennsylvania are serving life without parole. The national average is 3.6. Mm-hmm. There's actually 15 states that have less than 1% of their prison population serving life without parole. And then you start looking at the juvenile levels, and there was a lot of Supreme Court cases that just allowed for mandatory life without parole for juveniles. Pennsylvania still allows it for discretionary. So there's actually 31 states that do not have any individuals serving life without parole for crimes committed as juveniles, while Pennsylvania has a significant number of juveniles that, individuals now that were juveniles when they committed their crimes that are still serving life sentences within the confines of the correctional system. So there's a major outlier here from just who's eligible for individuals that have committed, first or second degree offenses or just are lifers in general. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the states that have, allow for parole consideration for most of their lifers are doing, things that are well. We've seen the lifer population across the country grow dramatically. It's actually more than quadrupled since 1984. I think since 2016, 1 in 9 people are serving a life sentence across the country that are incarcerated right now. And so you've seen this drastic shift into longer sentences, more rigid parole policies, and unfavorable parole boards that are sometimes handpicked by governors, AGs, or whoever else that essentially are denying parole at a much higher rate, particularly for lifers, or they're increasing legislatively the amount of time that you have to spend behind bars before you're able to even be considered for parole. So I think I saw that 8 states where the data is available right now, time served for parole lifers for murder convictions was 11.6 years in 1980. That increased up to 23 years from 2000 to 2013. So even in states where you are seeing much more eligibility and no mandatory life without parole for these lifer population, you are seeing individuals having to stay in prison much, much longer than they have been at any time in the past. And that's why we've seen these larger prison populations, particularly on the elderly side or the terminally ill side, across the country. This is not just a problem in Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania is really at the forefront of some of the major issues that you have with this, that it's really not great in a lot of places right now. There's very few jurisdictions that are doing parole with this population correctly, even if they do have that eligibility option. It's gotten worse. And a lot of this is because of, media, politics, and legislative changes that have really made it much more difficult for this population to be released.
Thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate that. I want to turn to Christina Reyes, who's joining us tonight. Christina, you bring a really unique voice to this conversation. Can you please tell us about your personal experience as a dual victim?
Yeah, certainly. At the age of 7, my stepfather was murdered, and about a few months later, my father was also killed with his brother. The person that was held accountable for my stepfather and his murder, it was 2 young men. And at the time, one was 17, the other one was 19. They were both convicted and they were sentenced to life without parole. Basically, what happened was a few years later, one of the young men was being resentenced because it was a youth resentencing law. And, for some time now as a kid, I was very resentful and very upset about, what I lost and devastated by losing not only my stepfather, but then also my father and my uncle, just like in a matter of months. But this man was coming home and I had an opportunity to actually confront him. And I got a letter, and basically he was just talking about how he had spent his time in prison, and the things that led him to there. And then also how he had, just taken the time to work on himself. I think that when I reflected as a woman opposed to a child, I come from a community where a lot of crazy things are taking place. There's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of violence taking place because people don't have the means. And sometimes I feel like we don't have the resources in this community. And by hearing what led him to that situation, but then also hearing that he had changed during his time being in prison, it gave me a different outlook. I also have 2 young boys, and I was thinking about their mindset at that age. I have a neighbor about 2 houses away from me, and she has a son that got into a situation, and right now he's incarcerated for life. The person that I love also was incarcerated at the age of 18 and has been in prison for about 23 years. So I was just thinking about how these things all just correlate. I've had family members in prison, and just in this community, you can knock on everyone's door and they know someone who's been impacted by this. And I just feel like, the fact that a person, went in for a certain crime or was convicted of something, at times we can't just look at them just for that one thing. We also have to see how they've adapted, because a lot of times they also need to be reformed. When I got a chance to hear his story and just kind of you know, sympathizing with him, because I did sympathize with the gentleman a lot. And although I was still kind of, you know, hurt because something was taken away from me, I also had an opportunity to see what was going on during that time in his life, and also what he had did during the course of being in prison to rehabilitate, and show that he was ready to come out into society and also give back to his community. When we go through these type of situations, it's not just the victims that are impacted. A lot of times there's also victims that are individuals that are incarcerated. The thing is that they don't have the help. You know, they don't have those resources. And the fact that he was doing something productive, the fact that I had the opportunity to confront him and allow him to know what I had gone through all those years, but also to kind of see what he had been doing to better himself, it made me look at this situation differently. The fact that I have someone that I love that I'm fighting for, and I know that that person has also changed drastically. And being in this setting as well with everyone who advocates, whether it's family members, whether it's organizers in this group, you know, we're just all in a room filled with hurt, and we're just trying to like find a resolution to this problem, because them just being incarcerated, that to me isn't the resolution. I feel like a lot of times it's just oppressing people opposed to really helping to restore their spirit and just make them feel like they can do a lot more productive things.
Christina, thank you so much. I recognize that it's not easy in the slightest, that's an understatement, to share the most personal, deeply painful and traumatic things that happen in your life, let alone in a public setting. So thank you for doing so. We hear you, and thank you for doing so. How did you take all of that and end up advocating independently and also with CADB, the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration?
Well, as I was stating, I've had family members that have been incarcerated. When I was young, my father was incarcerated. My cousin was a lifer as well. And then Matthew, the person that's in my background, he was not only like a childhood friend, someone that I went to school with, and someone that I grew to love. He was affected by his environment. There's so much trauma that takes place a lot of times that people don't know about, because they're not assessing the situation. They're just looking at, you know, how they got to the conviction. With him, I just, you know, me and him have been in touch, and, you know, I seen how he had progressed. I mean, he got himself into a situation, but at the same time, he's also, you know, one of those people that are working very hard, you know, to work on himself. He wants to give back to his community, like many other men and women that are in his situation. And I feel as though he went in at the age of 18, and a lot of lifers have been in prison for about, oh my God, it's 20, 40, 50 years. And, you know, they have a different mindset now. He's inspiring me every day, even prior to me coming onto this panel today. I had just seen him during a visit, and, you know, he's trying to be productive. We have a lot of those individuals that are mentoring individuals that come out to the society. And the thing is, I don't understand, why don't they have an opportunity to come home, when I don't think that anything is changing in terms of the rates that are taking place. They've been there. They definitely, you know, have changed. You know, they're applying themselves day in and day out. And I feel like also by him being there, and like many others, you know, it also oppresses the families, and we need to start bridging the gaps of the community so that people can start coming together.
Thank you so much, Christina. I want to turn to Kris Henderson of Amistad Law Project. Kris, your group has done so much around clemency, and I really consider Amistad to be experts in the area of clemency. Can you please give us an overview of what clemency is, because it can mean different things to different people? Why is it important? What's the state of clemency in Pennsylvania today?
Totally. Thank you for, thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this event. So people have said some of the statistics about the huge number of people who are serving life without parole or death by incarceration in Pennsylvania, over 5,000 people. There used to be a mechanism that really acted as a pressure release valve on this system. There was a point in time when the commutation process, like back in the 70s under Governor Schaap, hundreds of people were commuted who were serving life without parole or death by incarceration. And what happened is, of course, that number trended downward. And then in the 90s, it basically shut down entirely. And so what the commutation process looks like right now is incarcerated people can apply. There's like a multi-step written application. People often include really extensive information about their job plans, their home plans, letters of support or recommendation from people that they know across all sorts of swaths of society. Sometimes, let's see where I'll go next. Okay, so then it's often a year or more until people hear anything back at all. Once they do start to hear back, they are staffed, which means that at the prison where they're incarcerated, basically like it runs up the chain through the staff at the prison to say whether or not this person should be approved for release or whether this person should be granted commutation. If everyone up the chain says yes, this person will have an interview with the DOC secretary, who then gets to say the final yes or no as to whether or not this person is going to get the DOC recommendation. Sort of at the same time, the district attorney's office for whatever county that person was convicted in also gets to weigh in and say whether or not they think this person should be commuted. And unsurprisingly, in many parts of the state, that's just a formality, and really everybody, they're just saying no because of the original crime, which of course is something that somebody can't change, even 30, 40, 50 years later. So in the last few years, we've seen somewhat of a revival of the commutation process. Since 2018, 39 people who have virtual life or life without parole sentences have been had their sentences commuted. And so that's a very big increase. In the 20 years before 2018, there were only 15 people released. So yeah, in the 70s, over 250 people had their sentences commuted, and that's when fewer than 500 people were serving life without parole. And now we see that people who are serving life without parole or virtual life sentences, that number is over 8,000, and we're seeing dozens of people come home. And so while there are some people who are coming out through the commutation process, we know that it's not actually enough to really put a dent in the huge population of people who need some chance to show they've been rehabilitated, to show that they can come out and contribute positively to their communities. And then the other part of the process that I didn't mention a little is they have a merit review hearing, and they get interviewed by the board. If at the merit review stage, at least three of the 5 members say yes, this person should move forward. In that interview, if things go well, they will hopefully unanimously vote that person should get commuted. And then their application goes to the governor's desk, and he does an additional sort of review. It's not super clear what that consists of. And then at that point, if he thinks everything is good and that person should come home, signs the commutation, and the person is released. And so it's a really expensive process that often takes 3 years or more. in order for that person to actually be able to get out. And at that point, that person is on lifetime parole. And so still is subject to all of the restrictions of being on parole.
Thank you, Kris. You mentioned the vote, and I know earlier in the opening remarks and in our paper that we released, we talk about that unanimous requirement. Can you speak on that just for a moment and talk about why that is such a big hurdle for people? Why does the unanimous factor make it so difficult for people?
Definitely. So there are 5 people who are on the Board of Pardons. 2 of them are elected, the Lieutenant Governor and the Attorney General, and 3 of them are appointed. And the people who are elected are accountable to the public in a different way than the people who are appointed, for better or worse. And what we've seen people's voting records change on the board over time, but the idea that you need all 5 of these people to say yes in order for you to come home is a really high bar. Back in the 90s, when things just abruptly shut down, that's when we saw the requirement go from being a majority to being unanimous, which of course was in response to someone getting out through the commutation process, going on to commit really serious harm. But it was definitely a very reactionary thing, and not looking at the hundreds of people who had come home and had been really successful on commutation. The 3 appointed members are a victim advocate, a corrections expert, and a psychologist. And often we see, especially the corrections expert, sort of having a particular, view of people who are incarcerated, and one that doesn't allow for this idea that people can change, people have changed, especially after decades in prison. And so, I think one of the big things that needs to change at the Board of Pardons is for there to not be this unanimous requirement, because it is just kind of needlessly restrictive.
Thank you. And we were going to circle back to legislation at the end, but I do want to pause because I think there is legislation out there, Kris, to amend that. I believe it would have to also go through the constitutional amendment process. Are you familiar with those bills? Are you supporting those bills?
Yes, we definitely, support bills that would make it easier for people to come home through pretty much any mechanism. My understanding is that there's currently a bill that would change the requirement to 4, which, we think that really it should be 3. It should really be a majority. And yeah, it will have to go to a constitutional amendment, because that's actually the way that they changed it to be unanimous.
Thank you. And for everybody in the audience who's interested in tracking bill numbers, interested in talking to your lawmakers about specific bill numbers, FAMM's Pennsylvania page does have different tabs that break down the different bills, often with summaries around most of these issues. And I'm sure any of us on this panel tonight are happy to speak to any of you about specific bills and whether they're out there as well. I want to turn to Greg next and ask him to discuss medical and geriatric parole. Greg, what is medical release, medical parole, geriatric release or parole? Can you give us a little overview of the issue?
Yes, certainly. And so medical parole is generally, the statute will state that if a person suffers from a serious medical condition, maybe they'll call it terminal illness, serious medical illness, something that makes the individual no longer a threat to public safety, or if they're likely to pass soon, the person can be considered for release. And so 45 states at least have medical parole laws in one way, shape, or another. Most of them, they make individuals that are serving a life sentence, with or without parole, or a death sentence, generally ineligible for release. Some allow it for everyone. Some states specify that it must just be for a nonviolent offense, but it just depends on each state on how they handle that or not. 35 states address terminal conditions. Essentially, they just say that if unless you have a terminal illness, you are not going to be eligible. A lot of states have a time frame for when you're actually going to pass away. So in Pennsylvania, you know, it's a year or less, where they say that that's as much time as you are expected by a medical professional. You know, and most states allow for it to not necessarily be terminal, but if you have a serious medical condition, and then you can be put into like hospice care or something else like that, when you don't have a lot of time left to live. And then a lot of states actually allow it for, you know, revocation from the parole board if your health improves. And so even if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing on the outside, not committing, you know, any violations or doing, you know, committing any crimes, it can still revoke you back if your health doesn't improve. And so Pennsylvania has a medical parole statute. It's not great. It's rarely used. It's very, very complicated, and just flat out is just essentially a non-factor. And so although they do have medical parole in name, they don't really have it in practice. I believe I saw a stat that said only 9 people from 2010 to 2015 were actually released. And during that same time period, about 850 people died in Pennsylvania prisons. And so you're kind of seeing that disparity on where we can actually use this safety valve within medical parole. But it is you know, it is on statute, but I definitely think there can be improvements in Pennsylvania and a lot of other states across the country. Moving to geriatric parole. Geriatric parole essentially allows for consideration of release for individuals once they reach a certain age. And so, you know, some jurisdictions have it as low as 50, others up to 65, some 70 years old, depending on the sentence, and saying, you know, that, you know, once you hit a certain age and you are no longer a threat to public safety, that you could potentially be released. And again, very similar to medical parole, a lot of states that actually have this, it's about 24 states, the District of Columbia, and also the federal government have some sort of geriatric parole statute. They sometimes exclude certain offenses or force you to serve more time before you're eligible for geriatric parole, depending on the offense. They normally bifurcate it between, you know, nonviolent, violent, whatever that distinction may or may not be. And then, you know, sometimes the higher level offenses may be ineligible. Pennsylvania does not currently have a geriatric parole statute. And so individuals cannot be paroled or considered for parole based upon their age. And really the basis behind geriatric parole is saying, listen, individuals age out of crime. We know that for a fact. As you get older, it's less likely, if you've gone through the criminal justice system, that you're going to commit another offense. And it makes no sense from a public safety standpoint, from a good fiscal standpoint on taxpayer dollars, to maintain these individuals incarcerated. So at the very least, we should allow the parole board to consider them for release. Again, it's something that, you know, Pennsylvania should definitely look into implementing and doing it in a correct way. You know, as we've seen with other parole statutes across the country, even though Pennsylvania is very rigid, even in places where it is enacted, it's not utilized. And I actually think it's very interesting how you do have in one area geriatric parole, which is not enacted, and medical parole, which is enacted in Pennsylvania. You're almost getting the same amount of releases for each population, which is depressing. So not only do you need to pass these laws, they have to be enacted in a very good manner. So you know, the work is not done once the bill is signed.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I see that John Thompson has joined us tonight. JT, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi, welcome. Oh, no. No problem. Can you introduce yourself to our attendees tonight, JT?
Yes, I can. I'm John Thompson. I'm an organizer for ALC here in Philadelphia.
And we just heard a little bit about medical and geriatric parole, JT. Do you want to supplement any of the discussion about medical and geriatric parole? Why is that issue important to you? Why do we need medical and geriatric parole for people in prison?
Well, one of the first things that people need to understand is that you have elderly prisoners who are in prison who've been there for 20, 30, 40 years. And they are men and women who deserve an opportunity. They deserve an opportunity to go before the parole board, an opportunity, an opportunity to go before the parole board, because they are elderly. They are sick. A lot of them are sick, elderly, and they just want an opportunity to come home. They want an opportunity to die, to be there with their loved ones and die and at home. And I understand that people may say, well, they did this or they did that. Well, what about compassion? let's have compassion. Think about compassion. Think about giving somebody the opportunity to be able to come home.
Thank you so much. JT, I'm going to ask you to start us on the next question for the entire panel, which is, what work is your group doing, in your case, ALC? What work are you doing that you want to highlight in Pennsylvania around the issues that we've discussed tonight?
Well, one of the issues that we're surrounding is, is solitary confinement. I was late getting here, so I don't know if you had a discussion about solitary confinement, but that's one of the issues that we are deeply concerned about, because from a health standpoint, it's one of those issues that people are overlooking, the effects that it has on people being incarcerated, being placed in solitary confinement, the damages that it does to you as a human being, as a person. I myself was in solitary confinement. I did like 14 years in solitary confinement, so I know how it feels to be in solitary confinement.
Thank you so much. Let's turn to Roxanne. Roxanne, what is next for Second Chances in Pennsylvania, and what are you in Straight Ahead want to highlight around these issues?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. So like I said, Straight Ahead is the lobbying arm of Abolitionist Law Center. So we've been doing a lot of lobbying. So since we began, in the last 6 months or so, we've gone on, we've had visits to over 80 offices on the state level. We're also a statewide campaign. So we have organizers located across the state in different areas: Central Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. We also have a political educator on staff, and we're working to build out a victims network as well. And in addition to doing a lot of social media and comms work as well. And so even this month, we have a lot of political education workshops that we're doing before the Christmas holiday. If people are interested in hearing about that, you can contact me after. But we've been really trying to hit the legislator really hard and trying to get some of these bills passed, right? It's a really tough landscape. You're asking what's next for Second Chances in PA. Well, I'm not sure, Marie, because it's really rough out there, those streets. And we're hoping to, we've been, this group that we've been working in, this coalition, together. For people who don't know, all of these groups on this call, like, we work together as a coalition, and we are ideologically across the political spectrum, all advocating for these issues to end death by incarceration, in addition to winning geriatric and medical parole. And it's been really hard. We've been working with a Republican to potentially introduce a geriatric bill in the House. And we were really lucky, I think, to find him and find somebody that was that enthusiastic. But, now we're faced with his caucus giving him resistance. And so, it's challenging, but we're still going to keep on fighting.
Thanks, Roxanne. I appreciate it. Why do you find it, I'm going to turn to everybody else with the main question, but I want to pause for a moment. Why do you find it valuable to work with all these other groups across the political spectrum, as you mentioned? What's the value there?
Well, I think it just shows that there's consensus for these issues, that these issues really matter, and that, that it's not something that, is a Democrat issue or Republican issue. This is a human issue. And I think, combining and joining together with people who would not unite otherwise, I think it's a powerful statement.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Greg. Greg, what work do you want to highlight that AFP is doing around these issues? What do you think is the forecast in Pennsylvania? And I think you have a particular vantage point from this because you work a lot in Pennsylvania, but also have really surveyed the nationwide landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we talk a lot about sometimes like low-hanging fruit in states on what is possible. You look at kind of the landscape on everything else. And I think Pennsylvania has a lot of opportunities for low-hanging fruit and just to get in line with the vast majority of other states on where they're at in a lot of areas in their criminal justice system. So, we've talked a lot about just parole opportunities and consideration and how much of a outlier Pennsylvania is on some of these things. I discussed some of the states where, the average now for, first degree murder with lifers, their average to be paroled is about, 25 years and, 20 years or 23 years, depending on the state. And really just some of these bills, all they're asking is for the opportunity just to get in front of the board, at some of those timeframes. And so that's what we're really talking about right here. And so, I think that's a huge issue. Coming on to a couple other things, probation reform in the state of Pennsylvania, I think is such a critical aspect. When we give individuals a second chance, either on probation and parole, so many times we just have that could become a cycle of recidivism, revocation, bringing people right back into the criminal justice system. People don't really realize that probation and parole revocations are a huge driver of the prison system. And in some places, and in Pennsylvania, can amount to, sometimes half of the admissions going back in. And we're not talking about people committing new crimes a lot of the times. We're talking about individuals, committing technical violations, such as missing a meeting or failing a drug test, people trying to recover and get better. And what we're doing is punishing them, bringing them back into a place that has no mechanisms for recovery. And so I think that's a huge topic. I know probation reform has been talked about quite a bit in Pennsylvania, just really looking at potentially putting caps on, how much time you can be on supervision. A lot of, jurisdictions, and particularly in Pennsylvania, you have these lengthy probation and parole periods, 5, 10, 15 years. You have people that are doing the right thing, participating in programming, paying their fees and everything, and they have to continue to stay on. And the more and more they're on, the more and more likely they potentially slip up on some of these things. If you look at all of the requirements that you have on probation and parole, it is terrifying for someone that's on there that they might slip up and get revoked right back in just because of a mistake. And so I think that's a huge issue that they need to look at in Pennsylvania. And so those are probably the two biggest areas that we're looking at right now. Some of the other things that we're in, delving into a little bit off topic from where FAMM is some aspects of policing reform, looking at better transparency and accountability mechanisms that work not only to empower law enforcement to do their jobs and focus on their core functions of public safety, but also looking at community relations and building those back up. If you look at the clearance rates across the country on property crimes, violent crimes, they are woefully low. And I know particularly in Philadelphia right now, I think they just surpassed was it 500 murders at this point for the year or 300? I just saw something come up on Newsbrief, and many of those, I think less than half, are actually being solved. And so we really need to focus law enforcement to do their core government functions of public safety, not ask them to pick people up on low-level drug offenses, to stop focusing on these lower-level crimes, stop jailing people for long times, allow them to write a ticket to them so they're not going into the jail system, focus these things, not do things on civil asset forfeiture and remove those types of financial incentives to pick people up on fines and fees and lower level offenses and allow them to do their work, I think is incredibly critical and gets into a lot of the other stuff that we're talking about. And then looking at front end reforms, like I was just talking about with drug crimes and lower level offenses. Why are we incarcerating people on so many lower level crimes, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania? It is so difficult to get out of the criminal justice system when you get in. So we should really focus and pay attention on the higher risk people in there that we can actually kind of work through, rather than dealing with so many low risk people that really need rehabilitation or job opportunities or vocational training and things like that, and they're just not going to get those opportunities while they're incarcerated. And so I know that's a lot, but we work on a lot. So we're really excited. It's been tough in Pennsylvania, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. And there's a lot of great lawmakers out there that really want to work on this and really want to work on change. So I'm really excited about this coalition and kind of what we're going to be doing the next couple of years.
Thank you so much, Greg. Kris, how about you? We've talked a lot about, some of the challenges, some of, we're not sure about the forecast. Where are you seeing opportunities, and what exciting work at Amistad do you want to highlight for our attendees tonight?
We believe that the way we're going to win is by having a lot of organized, directly impacted people who can really powerfully tell their stories and sort of point us in the direction of where we need to go. And so we have a network of folks who we are working with, who have loved ones who are serving death by incarceration or other long sentences. I mean, we continue to support people with their commutation applications and advocate for the board to grant release to people who've been rehabilitated, to people who could come home without, really any sort of public safety concerns. And of course, for legislation that would actually allow the enormous number of older people who have served decades in prison to have a chance to come home. Yeah, all the things.
Thanks, Kris. Christina, how about you? How are you feeling about second chances in Pennsylvania based on your work, based on the experiences that you've had? We have a lot of families attending tonight, even though as the panelists, we can't see them. We have a lot of family members on here tonight who either have served or have loved ones serving extreme sentences in Pennsylvania. And they want to know, should we be hopeful? What's going to happen? What do you say to them?
I would say I'm definitely fighting for second chances. I have a person that I love that's serving life. I don't want him to die in prison. I want him to come out, and I feel like every time I have an opportunity to speak up and not only share my voice, but also I'm speaking on behalf of him. I'm speaking on behalf of other people. I'm in a group of people that are mothers, sisters, brothers, and they're fighting for their loved ones. We all want our people to come home. Like I said, again, it's oppressing for them. It's oppressing for us. One of the things that we're working on is political education. Even coming into these spaces, me, myself, I had to get educated on a lot of different things that I was not informed on, because I feel like when it touches you and it's close to home, that's when you really need to educate yourself, because you need to know what's going on. We're also talking to people who are individuals incarcerated, because we want to also fix certain situations that are going on within these facilities. We're meeting with the DOC to find resolutions to some of the issues that are constantly taking place, and working in collaboration with these different organizations. I really feel, as a person that's not only an advocate, but a family member, a loved one who has someone who's incarcerated, it's a big deal for me to have this space where I get to not only speak to people that are also kind of going through the same situation that I'm going through, but can actually relate to these issues. And I feel like we need to continue these conversations and continue having more people in these groups so that we can start bringing people home. I think that if we have more people go out and speak to their legislators, because they do want to hear from their constituents. And I hear that a lot in meetings, not just from organizers, but constituents, and hearing these stories, from people who are actually living this day in and day out, that's going to make it more powerful. Because as Henderson was saying, commutation, we have that, but how many people are actually coming home? So it's so important that we stress pushing these bills, that we're in their faces, because we need to do something so that it can be a change. I mean, we're in 2021 now, and we need to make a difference. I don't feel like anyone should be in prison and have to die there. And I don't feel like anyone should be old and coming out of prison either. I feel like they need to have an opportunity to showcase what they've done and how they've progressed. And I think that needs to be something that's highlighted. And I do believe in second chances, Maria.
Thank you. And for FAMM and for myself personally, even the days that are really hard, and there are days that are really hard, every day there are more and more people calling me, writing me, signing up to talk to their lawmakers, asking how they can get involved, people who are coming home, people who have family members every race, every county in Pennsylvania, every political party is affected by this issue. Although don't get me wrong, it absolutely disproportionately affects certain communities more than others, but I'm seeing more and more people drawn to this issue every day. And so even though it's hard, I think we're working together, we're getting more strategic, and we are putting out a ton of good material and a ton of good education for the public, for lawmakers, for the press, all of our organizations around these issues. So please check out FAMM's new paper. We did put an action in the chat that you can take to write directly to your lawmaker to say, yes, I support second chances. Yes, I support the recommendations that are made in the paper, all of which we discussed tonight. For FAMM's part, we have a family call for anybody that wants to jump in and strategize the first Thursday of every month. All of these organizations, whichever one you're ideologically drawn to, or all of them, we all have members that go to all of our meetings. You're welcome to come and talk to any of us. We'd all be happy to discuss any of it. And we do actually need you all. This isn't a passive, FAMM, straight ahead, AFP, Amistad, Christina, are they doing all the work? I can sit back. That's not the case. We need you. We need you to tell your stories. If you're not directly impacted, we still need you. We need you to talk to your lawmakers and tell them that you still care about the issue. So everybody who's attending here tonight has a role to play. Please get in touch with us. I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. We have about 5 minutes left. And so we do have a moment to take any questions. And if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. There's also a Q&A function, and you can direct questions to the panel or to a specific panelist. So does anybody in the audience, we can't actually see you. So if anybody has your hand raised, I can't see it, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we have just a few minutes left. And I do want to thank all of our panelists and your organizations for participating tonight and for your fantastic work in Pennsylvania. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll let everybody know that tonight's panel will be replayed. If you know people who would have liked to have attended, who couldn't attend, this will be replayed on Facebook Live this Sunday night, the 21st at 6 p.m. And it'll also go on FAMM's YouTube page. Let's see, I do see one question from Mr. Cooperman. Thank you for the panel regarding registered citizens. Could you speak to the Torsolari case? And do you have any insights as to licensure for returnees? Mr. Cooperman, I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that tonight. I think it's a little bit outside the scope of what was on the agenda for tonight, but I will definitely ask our other panelists. Does anybody feel able to answer that right now, or is that something we can follow up with offline?
I can talk a little bit about occupational licensure and what that looks like and some of the complications there. A lot of the times, individuals get released from prison. They've learned a trade or a vocation if they're lucky enough to be in a prison that offers some sort of that programming. And then they're ineligible to practice that when they leave the confines of a jail or a prison because of their felony conviction. And so a lot of these licensing schemes that are crafted by agencies disallow individuals from participating in that trade because they need an occupational license. And that license either denies someone explicitly because of their felony conviction or will deny them because they do not have good moral character or some of these questions. So AFP has worked across the country with a lot of different organizations to try to remove those barriers on occupational licensing schemes that disallow for individuals that do have a felony record from being able to participate in those vocations. And so, you have these crazy ones. I know, like you license florists in Louisiana, and interior designers have all this training and time and money and all these exemptions for who can participate and not. And so it's a major problem because we want to allow individuals to learn trades and skills while they're incarcerated, but then we deny them the access to actually be able to work in these vocations once they get released. And so it's a major, major issue. A lot of other things going on, and there's some states that are doing this now, is to allow for, driver's license to be obtained, Social Security cards, all these documents that you need to even apply for other jobs that don't require an occupational license is a critical aspect. And some states are now finally getting that together at the point of right when they get in to help them get their birth certificate and all these other things that require that. And so it'd be great to see Pennsylvania enact some of these changes and kind of reduce those barriers to getting a job once people get released.
Thank you so much. We do have two more questions or a few questions in the Q&A, and I personally can stay on for another few minutes. Hopefully our panelists can as well to answer some of these questions. In the meantime, thank you everybody for attending if you're not able to stay on. We have Mr. Hassan asking, what about the exception for killing a police officer? Kris or Roxanne, are one of you able to comment on Basim Hassan's question or comment here?
I'm going to pass that to Kris because they were around when that was added.
I mean, as far as like, okay, I'm looking at the question again. Okay, yeah, I mean, we believe that we are explicitly abolitionists who don't believe that prisons work and don't believe that locking people up changes them for the better. I think that there are a lot of people who, after spending decades in prison, have become better people. I personally think that's in spite of being incarcerated, not because of it. And I think the same sorts of arguments and the same sorts of things that we say about people who should come home, should have a meaningful chance to come home, apply also to people who are convicted of killing law enforcement. Unfortunately, there is this, like in our popular culture, there is this desire to exceptionalize police officers and therefore to further punish people who are convicted of killing law enforcement. You know, we don't think that makes sense, and that should be like sort of codified in law. But also we recognize that that these bills would allow many people to come home, and so we support them in spite of not agreeing with them entirely. That's sort of my rambly answer.
Thank you, Kris. That's great. And I would just say generally, you know, in the broader context, it is a constant conversation around most bills, really not even just in the criminal justice context, about what to negotiate in, what to negotiate out, you know, and in the criminal justice realm, you know, what exclusions or carve-outs do supporters think will make a bill actually pass? And so that is a constant, I think, internal debate for everybody on this panel that we take extremely seriously. I think everyone on this panel agrees that we would like to see no carve-outs, redemption possibilities for everyone. So I would agree primarily with what Kris said and just say that's an ongoing conversation that all of us discuss, debate, take to heart, and consider very seriously from all angles. We have another question that says, given the I'm sorry.
I think Salim wanted to say something on that point.
I don't have him enabled as a panelist right now, but I can come back to him in just a moment. We do have another question that says, given the overwhelming youth of people at the time of their incarceration, are there efforts to factor people's age at the time of the incident into parole legislation? Roxanne, would you like to answer that question?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, it was a little bit.
Sure. It says, given the overwhelming youth of people at the time of their incarceration, so people being very young going into prison, are there efforts to factor people's age at the time of the offense into parole legislation?
So as far as like the age of like people going in young, so like juveniles are sentenced a bit differently than people over 18, but as far as people over 18, the sentencing is the same. So, so if you're over 18 when the crime is committed, then you're out of luck and you're sentenced to life without parole. But currently for people who are under 18, there are other options, other than life without parole. Was that the question?
I think so. And I think I would say that, currently in the system, having been a trial attorney here for several years prior to beginning policy work with FAMM, I think age is a factor. Currently in parole, if you were 18 as opposed to 35, that's something the parole board may consider, but that's not going to matter a lick if you have a mandatory sentence that that doesn't let the parole board consider you for parole. Salim, I want to let you speak. I'm just trying to figure out how to do it, so just give me one moment. We do have another question that says, my loved one is in federal prison. Can some of FAMM or other groups' letters for states be modified for representatives and senators in the federal government? And I mean, I think we have a lot of public materials. And so, if something is publicly on our website, I think you'd certainly have to, double check all the data. I'm not sure that things are going to be, the numbers are certainly not going to directly correlate. But you are certainly, anybody is free to look at, review, and share any of our public materials, as long, obviously, as FAMM or the other groups are given attribution and you check the data. So, all right, I am working on Salim here. All right, Salim, I sent you a message asking you to unmute, and there you go.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me?
Yes, and could you just introduce yourself for our attendees, Salim?
Yes, my name is Robert Salim Holbrook. I'm the Executive Director of the Abolitionist Law Center and our C4 Arms Straight Ahead. And I just been listening. I'm on my way up to Maine and driving. This has been really great. And thank you everyone who came out tonight, and all the panelists have been great. And thank you, Maria, for giving me this time just briefly to speak. And I know we're over time, so I don't want to take up too much space, but I did want to answer the question around police exemptions. That is something that I believe that all of us are opposed to and that do not support. However, that exemption is something that unfortunately is not within our power at this time to change. And I like to tell people that it's an example that as a movement, we have to build stronger, build bigger, so that when we have criminal justice reform legislation, we'll have the power and the influence to ensure that carve-outs don't happen and exemptions don't happen. So this is something that, this exemption here is something that, and many other exemptions that we do not support, but unfortunately, when it comes to legislation, you get at that point where the rubber meets the road. And when we were talking to the sponsors of this legislation, they were very clear that in order for them to get buy-in, and not just from the Republicans, but also from Democrats as well, this is something that had to be in. So I just wanted to share that this is something that none of us, we don't take it lightly. It's not something that we endorse. It's unfortunately just part of the real politic of criminal justice reform legislation, and just a reminder that those of us who are fighting for progressive criminal justice reform and smart criminal justice reform have to get a lot stronger. So I just wanted to share that response with everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I believe that we have answered all the questions. We are a few minutes over, so I'm going to let everybody go. And I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I encourage you to reach out to anyone on this panel. We'd all be happy to talk to anyone individually about these issues anytime. And a big thank you again to all of our fantastic panelists for the amazing work that you do. Good night.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you.